Aware of what USAID is, we're talking about the U.S. Agency for International Development, which is a body of the federal government of the United States. It's been in existence since 1961 and is primarily tasked with delivering foreign aid and foreign assistance to other countries abroad. So I think that this is a very important topic because when we have nice, polite liberals or even social democrats a lot of the time, you often hear an argument, something along the lines of, well, we know that the United States spends far too much money on the military. If instead they would just give all of the money to foreign aid through USAID or something along those lines, the US would be a constructive and beneficial partner on the global, as a member of the global community. But again, as Breht mentioned, USAID really also has some pretty pernicious roles in upholding the imperialist world order as well as colonial relations between the United States and other countries. And that's something that I'm hoping to get into during this recording.
Yeah, I mean, like the way that it describes itself as an agency for administrating foreign aid development or like handing out humanitarian assistance, like cloaked in this like kind of liberal language that appeals to, Westerners. It's really interesting because, that's what they claim to be. But the purpose of it really is it's basically an agency which the primary task, and it wouldn't ever tell you that, but the primary task of it is to open up foreign markets for Western corporations. And it does that through, what we were talking about, like humanitarian aid, development assistance, but also through contracting out to businesses to conduct that aid, and contracting out to businesses these sort of democracy promotion programs, like these psychological operations that promote or that they seek out political dissidents in areas of the world with governments that the U.S. may not like. And they sort of train them and then they train them to become political activists and like give them visibility in hopes that they will lead a movement to overthrow the government. So really, really interesting, sort of like a dual-pronged approach that they take.
Yeah, and speaking to your point, sorry, Adnan, really quickly, just speaking to your point about buzzwords, who could be against development? Who could be against humanitarian aid or human rights or democracy? And this sort of language is what the overall project is shrouded in, and making it even, less likely to be critiqued or to have eyebrows raised at what it's doing. It just seems like a wholly good thing because it presents itself in this precise language, which really appeals particularly to liberal people.
Women's rights is another one that they generally use as justification for a lot of their interventions abroad.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I think you've been emphasizing this liberal soft power orientation that USAID plays in U.S. foreign policy and geopolitical empire. And it sounds like it's more subtle, but I think, interestingly, the USAID website itself betrays some very interesting information about how directly national security objectives and goals are priorities for this agency. I mean, the first thing to point out is that it's organized around various world continental regions. But there's one exception, to that, which is the Middle East gets its own region. And why is that the case? Is because there's so much U.S. imperial military involvement there that the sort of adjunct support that USAID needs to provide in terms of support, services, democracy initiatives, all of this kind of programming and U.S. aid being directed needs to support very much the U.S. imperial military mission. And so they say, even in their orientation about the Middle East region, sub-region of USAID, is that its priorities in the Middle East and North Africa fall within 3 areas. And the very first one they mention is supporting core U.S. national security objectives. So, and the others, of course, mitigating human impact of ongoing conflicts in the region and fostering inclusive development and reform. And those latter 2 are the more liberal kind of soft power orientation, but they're very direct, right? It's not subtle at all. Supporting U.S. core national security objectives. So I think that's one thing to point out, is that where there is a lot of U.S. military involvement, it's clear that this agency has to do a lot of the kind of cleanup, post-op, kind of political managing of post-conflict situation, and also fomenting, as I think, Amanda, you were pointing out, choosing actors who might overthrow or undermine hostile governments. That seems to be a big part of how they even imagine their work in this region. So there's less talk about, there is, of course, talk about women's rights, democratization, all these things, but they have to be very upfront and obvious with this because that's the reason they're there. But going back to the history, I would be interested to hear what else people think about how it operated within the Cold War and immediately post-Cold War, how those things shifted or changed since it started in 1961. That's clearly, under the Kennedy government, where you could say that there was the charm offensive in the Cold War, to have the U.S. be this, globally identified power on behalf of democracy, meaning capitalism. And that's also the era where, the Peace Corps was developed. And these things seem to go hand in hand, and so I'm wondering what you think about how it operated in the Cold War and then the immediately post-Cold War. In the 90s, it was the era of globalization and this triumphalist neoliberalism. And during this period, it seems that humanitarian aid was transformed. And so maybe it's worth thinking about that before we talk about the contemporary. Is just how did this sort of develop?
Well, I'll say one thing in terms of sorry, I'll let you go next, Amanda. Just one quick thing then, in terms of the early history of USAID. When we're talking about the stated goals versus what was happening under, the cloak of darkness, as it were, even from the very, very early days of this agency being in operation, we're talking about the early 60s here and then into the 70s, well into the 70s, as William Blum writes in Killing Hope, the CIA was closely enmeshed with USAID, and many, many CIA operatives were on missions using USAID as cover, saying that they were USAID representatives in these different countries. So it makes it hard in a way to understand what really USAID was doing in different parts of the world, because in some cases, USAID was doing things themselves that were benefiting the U.S. imperial machine, benefiting U.S. colonial relations with other countries around the world. But in other cases, they were just used as a smokescreen without even necessarily being directly involved with things that were happening that the U.S. was pushing through other organizations like the CIA, which, nominatively at least, are completely independent from one another. But this was happening even early on, in the early days of USAID being in existence. So it makes it really difficult to be able to say to what extent USAID itself was pushing a lot of these interventions abroad that were trying to topple communist regimes, socialist regimes, trying to open up doors for US-based corporations into different countries, extract further profit in terms of natural resources from different countries. It makes it hard to say. Amanda?
Yeah, I'm actually really interested to learn more about the history of ties to the CIA, but I just wanted to add a little bit to the history that Adnan provided earlier. So as he said, it was created in 1961 during the Kennedy administration. And when it was first created, Kennedy described its mission to Congress and that the USAID had and USAID had three obligations to other countries. And one was like a moral obligation as the wise leader of nations. Second was an economic obligation as the wealthiest people in a world of largely poor people. And the third was a political obligation as the single largest counter to the adversaries of freedom. So like what you saw in the early years of USAID was that it just created an infrastructure where private businesses and market principles could form and thrive. And so that involved easing trade regulations in like different countries, offering loan guarantees to businesses, providing scholarships for students to study, for their students to study here in the US, and creating these agricultural development programs that open the markets of poor countries to large agribusiness. So these policies benefited the private sector, but the private sector was not necessarily involved in implementing them. But starting like more post-Cold War, like in the 2000s, however, the role of the private sector in USAID has increasingly grown. And now USAID sets up contracts with private businesses to design and execute foreign development programs under the USAID banner. So it basically functions now as a contractor like to the private sector and hands out multi-million-dollar contracts to corporations like DuPont, Johnson & Johnson, Microsoft, Coca-Cola to provide development in countries in the global South. And like maybe we can get into this later, but oftentimes these programs, it ends up being disastrous.
I can say something to that right now if you'd like. So one of the things that I think is really interesting is this relation between U.S. aid and private companies. And one of the bigger scandals in terms of the scope of it, not necessarily the media coverage that it got, is the Nestle baby formula scandal. Anybody remember that when that happened? It happened for like 30 years or something like that, but it really only broke in the news a few years ago. Essentially what was happening is Nestle was doing all sorts of advertising and having fake nurses and whatnot push their baby formula to newborn infants and mothers that were still in the hospital so that they would think that baby formula was better for children than breast milk. Of course, it is not. There is nothing better for a child than breast milk for many different reasons, both from nutritive standpoints, both from immunological standpoints. There's many, many aspects where breast milk is better. But of course, you don't make money having kids eat breast milk. You make money by having them take baby formula. So Nestle was pushing baby formula as this like magic elixir, basically. And they were really trying to have women around the world, particularly in poor areas, have baby food use. And one of the areas that this was in widespread usage was West Africa, particularly the Ivory Coast. What they found is that there was a few problems with this. Not only is baby food not nearly as good as breast milk, but also the water that they were using was not clean. Breast milk is sterile. The water that many of these women were using to make their baby food, not sterile. That's very bad for babies. Also, baby formula is pretty expensive for women that are living in the rural Ivory Coast. So they were diluting their baby formula so much that the children were actually getting sick and dying in many cases of malnutrition. There's some estimates that up to 1 million children were affected by malnutrition as a result of this baby food being pushed on these women in the global South. So one thing that I thought was interesting was how U.S. aid was related to Nestle. So I did some digging and I found this article from the Los Angeles Times, April 23rd, 2005. White House comes to UN nominee's defense, and that UN nominee, of course, is John Bolton. We all remember him. But when you go down in this article, you find this very interesting point, and they're talking about his demeanor. John Bolton was this mean guy, and that was one of the reasons why he wasn't going to be confirmed. Meanwhile, a former subordinate of Bolton's offered to provide information to the committee about the way she said that Bolton treated her in the early 1980s when they both worked at the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. In a letter to Senator Barbara Boxer, Lynn D. Finney said Bolton had bullied her and tried to have her fired when they clashed over U.S. policy on the distribution of infant formula in developing countries, an issue that was then highly visible and politically charged. Finney said she was working as a USAID attorney and had developed relationships with foreign officials at the United Nations. She said that in late 1982 or early 1983, Bolton called her into his office and told her to use her influence to persuade the United Nations to ease a policy that restricted the marketing and promotion of infant formula in developing countries. Finney objected, saying that she could not in good conscience push for such changes because she believed that the improper use of formula in poor countries was jeopardizing the health of babies. Quote, "He shouted that Nestle was an important company and that he was giving me a direct order from President Reagan," she wrote in the letter. "He yelled that if I didn't obey him, he would fire me." When she persisted, Finney said, "He yelled that I was fired." He later found out that she couldn't be fired, but he shifted her out. So it was just a very interesting relation, and I think it goes to tell a little bit of that story of the relation between private companies and U.S. aid and kind of how that has a somewhat pernicious effect in different parts of the world for the profit of these American, as well, it's Swiss-based, but
I think it's worth always saying whenever John Bolton is brought up that, I mean, this person is an absolute psychopath. In any healthy society, he would be locked in a cage with a Hannibal Lecter muzzle on, but he flourishes within the American institutions, particularly around foreign policy. All the way up through the Trump administration, still has a role as a talking head on Fox News. And no amount of blood and suffering from innocent people is enough to satisfy that particular person. But again, that's just an individual, and the fact that he's been able to maintain a career so long within American institutions, I think says more about American institutions than it does about him proper. Kind of a tangent, but always worth mentioning.
Well, I would also, we've talked a little bit about some of the economic work that they've done on behalf of U.S. companies. I think, picking up on that theme of